Hey, it's Lay. If you've been keeping up with me lately, then you know that I had planned on doing a live stream on pain and types of grief, and I was going to do that tomorrow. But because I have not been feeling well and some other things, I have decided to reprioritize. So instead of doing it tomorrow, I have made this video for you, and I will be doing other things with my time tomorrow. But just to be upfront, I am looking at my computer screen as I talk to you because I really just didn't want to take the time to prepare any more than I already have for it. And that's just me being honest. But let's get into it. So we're talking about types of grief from pain to blank. And this kind of comes from this idea that pain, we all experience it, right? In one way or another, pain can be transformed into something else. It can be transformed into your purpose, into your passion. I've heard people say power. I've heard people say prosperity. And it doesn't have to start with a P, of course. It just sounds cooler if you do that. But this video is intended to help you figure out how you can take whatever pain it is that you have experienced, are experiencing, will experience, and turn it into a positive. Make it something that can really propel you in life. And so I'm going to do that. We'll start by talking about some definitions, and then we're going to talk about the 5 stages of grief, and there are different models that have more stages, but I will just start with that one. And then we're going to talk about song lyrics, and we'll close by talking about why we should be talking about this and why we should still care about this, especially if it's a sort of pain or grief that is way back in your past. All right, so let's get into it. Definitions. Okay, so the first word that I want to define is pain. So according to Merriam-Webster, pain is to make suffer or cause distress to, hurt. And then I also wanted to look up more of a health/medical definition. So I found this at the National Institutes of Health. Specifically, it was an article, and anything that I reference in here, if y'all want the links, I'll send them to you. But it was an article that referenced the International Association for the Study of Pain. And in that article, they define pain as an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage or described in terms of such damage. So let's pause here. So according to Merriam-Webster, right, pain is to make suffer or cause distress, so basically to hurt. It doesn't specify whether this is a physical hurt or an emotional or some other kind of hurt. But when we get to the NIH, National Institutes of Health definition, it does talk about that, right? It talks about this being an emotional experience and how it's associated with tissue damage. And if you're unfamiliar with tissue systems in the body, we can just ask me a question or send me a direct message. I would be happy to discuss that further. But for the sake of time, I'm going to move on from that right now. Or described in terms of such damage. And I think that is such a critical piece of this, because a lot of times people tend to separate physical pain or even physical health from mental and emotional pain or mental and emotional health, but really they are connected, they're interrelated. Okay, so the next definition, grief. According to Merriam-Webster, grief is their first definition, a deep and poignant distress caused by or as if by bereavement. And bereavement is the mourning of a loved one. So caused by or as if by bereavement, which indicates that you can experience grief even if you have not lost somebody. And then the second part of that definition, a cause of such suffering. So what has caused you to grieve can be a definition of grief. And then I found another more medical definition, and this comes from an article called Grief Reaction and Prolonged Grief Disorder, which I also found through the National Institutes of Health. And in this article, they say that grief is a natural and universal response to the loss of a loved one. The grief experience is not a state, but a process, which leads us into our 5 stages of grief. And to be clear, these 5 stages are not necessarily linear. That means that you don't necessarily have to go from stage 1 to stage 2, 3, 4, 5. You can go in any order. You can go to one stage and then come back to the previous stage. Like this is not intended to mean that you go through it in a sequence, but for the sake of simplicity, we will be discussing it in that way. But just kind of on your own time, if you want to think about this, just kind of think about it from your own perspective, maybe just taking an example of how you've experienced grief and how you process that grief. So, in the 5 stages of grief model, number 1 is denial, number 2 is anger, number 3, bargaining, 4, depression, 5, acceptance. And to explain each of these stages to you, I'm going to use my personal example of my first episode, psychosis, which I experienced in 2017, January 2017, so the very beginning of the year. Okay, so stage number 1, denial. Denial can be thought of as a numbness, emotional numbness. So you're thinking or telling yourself that nothing happened, and your beliefs or those things that you're telling yourself don't match reality. So for me personally, when after the psychosis the psychotic symptoms had been relieved with medication, I was definitely in denial because this had never happened to me before. Like I said, this was my first episode of psychosis. It had never happened to me before. And so everything that I thought I knew, because I had heard it, a hallucination, I saw it, I thought it, whatever it was, that was my reality and nobody else's. And I can tell you, each time I've experienced psychosis, I have never believed anything else so hard in my life. So it's difficult to accept that I had gone through that. And not only that, now you're telling me that it wasn't even real. So that was my kind of denial stage, which began when I was in the psychiatric ward. Number 2, anger. So we know what anger is. I'm not going to define it, but let's talk about why we get angry. It's a natural emotion, and it usually stems from a feeling of being treated cruelly or unfairly, right? So for me personally, I was angry at God because I identify as a Christian, and in my head, I was doing everything I was supposed to be doing. Why did this happen to me, of all people? I mean, I've grown tremendously since then, but there's a difference between, for Christians, people of faith, believers, there's a difference between faith and belief, if you think about it, right? Your faith, there shouldn't be an expectation necessarily associated with that unless it's biblical or it's founded in the scripture. But your beliefs, on the other hand, do have expectations associated with them. So I believed that because I went to church and I served in a youth ministry and I did this and I did that, I believed that psychosis shouldn't have happened to me. All right, bargaining. So basically, this is us making deals with ourselves, with others, with God, and it's about what if. Well, if only I hadn't done that, this wouldn't have happened to me. Or, well, God, if I'm on my best behavior, will you turn this around for me? Things like that. That's what bargaining is. Fourth stage, depression. So depression, and this comes from an article, and I can give this to you because I did not write down the author, but this is a direct quote from the article, and I think I found it on cruse.org.uk. Cruse is CRUSE. And it defines depression, or they define depression as sadness and longing are what we think of most often when we think about grief. This pain can be very intense and come in waves over many months or years. Life can feel like it no longer holds any meaning, which can be very scary. Depression. Of course, I was depressed for a long time. Sometimes we're depressed and we don't even realize it, but I was so sad because I had this plan for my life that fell apart. It did. It fell apart. And I couldn't see past my present moment for a very long time. So that was very difficult for me. Very intense. Like it was hard for me to reintroduce myself to the world because what I had experienced changed my entire perception of the world and myself and God and a lot of other things. But so yeah, it was very intense pain and emotion for me. And I did deal with that for years. Even though I was back in the workplace or back in school, that doesn't mean that I wasn't still dealing with the effects, emotional effects of what I had experienced psychologically. And then the last part of that, life can feel like it no longer holds any meaning, which can be very scary. It can. So for me, what's my purpose? Like, why am I here? If I can't do what I said I was going to do and I have failed in my mind, there's nothing left for me. So when people start thinking that, that's where you get your people with severe depressive disorders, people who don't want to be here, people who end up not being here because of a choice that they made. So it's very real in that regard. And then the final stage is acceptance. And same article, and I quote, gradually, most people find that the pain eases and it is possible to accept what has happened. Thank God that that's my story. And they also said in this article that people essentially learn to live again, which is what I had to do. And I also wanted to throw in here that live again piece that I read in that article reminded me of a sermon I heard when I was in Pittsburgh. So before my psychotic episode, it was Pastor Brian J. Edmonds of Macedonia Church of Pittsburgh. If you want those notes, I think I have them, and I will be glad to send them to you. But it's basically talking about this sort of thing in so many words. If I don't have them, I can contact him and see if he has them. But either way, I can talk about it a little bit in more detail, what I remember of that sermon, if that's something you're interested in. Okay, so now let's get into song lyrics. So a lot of us enjoy music, probably different kinds of music, which is totally fine. But what's the purpose of, songs and songwriting and music, right? It's to express ourselves, express our emotions a lot of the time. And so, like, you hear people write songs about love or about losing somebody, about all kinds of things, but it's oftentimes a reflection of how they're feeling, a reflection of what they're going through, some experience that they've had. And so I had a question on one of my stories asking people for their input on a song that they would want me to kind of discuss for this pain and grief discussion. And so the song that we chose is One Sweet Day by Mariah Carey and Boyz II Men. If you haven't heard it, or if you haven't heard it in a long time, because it is an older song, check it out. It's on YouTube, Spotify, whatever. And so what I did was I just pulled out a few of the lyrics. We're not going to go through the whole song. So the first lyrics that I kind of extracted from this song, it says, "Assumed you'd always be there. I thought you'd always be there. And I take your presence for granted, but I always cared." And to me, when I think about that, I think, how many times do we go through life with pain, with hurt, with grief, and treat the people we love the most the worst sometimes? And too often, that person is gone before you can show them that you really did care. You just weren't able to get past whatever you were going through. Or maybe you never would have gotten there. But now that they're gone, you wish that you had. The next part of the verse that I wanted to talk about, and I know eventually we'll be together. We'll be together one sweet day. And to me, that's us trying to comfort ourselves, right? We'll be together. I'll get that chance to tell you how I felt. I'll get that chance to show you that I cared. But in the meantime, I've got to live with the fact that I didn't do it while you were still here. So it's just kind of, it makes me think, like, why do we treat people the way we do sometimes? Because in the grand scheme of things, we're not eternal. And why do we want to live miserably? Like, why do we have to wait? If you believe in heaven or some sort of afterlife, why do we need to wait until we get there to live, to love? And then the last part of the song, and I want to say these are the very last lines of the song. "Sorry I never told you all I wanted to say." And I'll just leave that there. So, we're coming to a close here. But why do we talk about grief? And I'm just going to give you some of my personal insights. If you've got some insights, which I'm sure you do, leave them in the comments, send me a message, however you want to communicate with me, if you want to communicate that. But why do we talk about it? So for me, it's part of my healing journey. When I experienced psychosis for the first time in 2017, I didn't talk about it for so long. And even when I did start talking about it, I only told a little bit here and there. And there's nothing wrong with that. Not everybody deserves to hear your story. I'm not saying you need to go tell your business to everybody. And if you don't want to tell your business, that's your business. But for me personally, the longer I held it in, the longer I grieved. Healing for me came when I started talking about it, when I started being real about it. So that's why, to me, we should talk about grief. We should talk about pain. And you probably can understand to some extent the pain that I felt. And in terms of grieving, like, I felt like I lost who I was. I didn't have purpose anymore because I couldn't finish that degree, which was going to get me that job, which was going to take me so many places. Next reason, in my opinion, that we need to talk about grief: relationships. Not just romantic ones, platonic ones, your friends, even your siblings, your parents, also romantic ones, your husband, your wife, your partner, your supervisor, your employees, your relationships. Because whether you realize it or not, unresolved pain or grief that has not been adequately processed is going to affect the way you think. It's going to affect the way you behave. And that's going to, in turn, affect the way that you treat people and how you're perceived by people. Another reason, last reason for this discussion, that I think we need to talk about grief, to get through life. To get through life. We all have pain. We all grieve. And if we're not talking to each other, if we're not understanding each other, there's no way for us to move forward, because there are so many different kinds of people on this planet, everywhere you go, whether they look like you or not, that have been through something. And if we stay trapped in our own minds, in our own little worlds, our own little bubbles, we'll never understand that. We're going to continue to think it's all about me when that's not the case. And so I'm going to end with this. And this is, I guess, your homework. I think I've already answered it, but why should we still care? If this is something, especially that happened to you years ago, why should we still talk about it now?